Do you believe art can change the world? So do I. On this show, we meet artists whose work is doing just that. Welcome to Art Heals All Wounds. I'm your host, Pam Uzel. I have a question. When did you realize that you loved bats? For me, it was when my parents took me when I was in early elementary school to Carlsbad Caverns to watch the bats fly out at dusk. I'm hoping that everyone, at least once in their lives, has the chance to see a large colony of bats flying out to begin their nightly bug hunt. It's one of the most awe-inspiring things I've ever seen. Today, documentary filmmaker Kristin Tièche talks about her upcoming film, The Invisible Mammal. If you, like me, are fascinated by bats, this is a film you'll want to see. And if you think you don't like bats, this film will change your mind. Bats do so much that make the world livable for us. Whether it's pollinating our fruit-bearing trees and shrubs, or eating crop-destroying insects, a healthy and sizable bat population is definitely something that we need, even if you don't think that they're the endlessly interesting and adorable animals that I do. Unfortunately, many bat colonies and even whole species are in trouble. Their biggest threat is habitat loss, but they've also been harmed by humans entering the caves where they roost and exposing them to germs. Kristin talks about the North American bat colonies that are currently under threat from white nose syndrome, a fungus found in Europe or Asia that was introduced into North American caves with bat colonies from, in all likelihood, the sole of someone's shoe. In Kristin's film, we also learn about the scientists who are working to find ways to help North American bats survive this new threat. You want to know how you can really help me keep this show going? Follow me on your favorite listening app. So easy, right? And if you really want to give the show a boost, leave me a 5-star rating or review. Hi, Kristin. Thank you so much for being on Art Heals All Wounds. Can you start by telling us who you are and what you do?
Sure. Thanks for having me on the show, Pam. So my name is Kristin Tièche, and I'm a filmmaker, and I live in the San Francisco Bay Area. I live in San Francisco, actually. And I am currently making my first feature documentary, and that is called The Invisible Mammal. There's a visual for those who get to see the visual. And it is a film about bat conservation in North America and women in science.
Yes, and that's how I discovered your work, is that I saw this notice about a documentary being made about bats, and I love bats. And I thought, I have to go to this little Zoom thing, because you were going to show a clip that you had finished as part of the film. And I just thought it was wonderful. The stuff on your website too, it's not the exact same clip. It's like a little, a trailer or a teaser on the website.
Exactly.
The clip you showed went into a little more depth about one particular issue in the documentary. But before we talk about that film at all, I want to hear how you decided to make a film about bats. It's not the first time you filmed bats, is it?
Correct. So my bat story, I like to tell my bat story, my bat origin story. It all started when I was a film student. So my bat story and my filmmaking journeys are kind of one and the same. And when I was a film student in upstate New York at Syracuse University, there was a pub that was on campus. And in the summer months, we would go out and sit on the patio and have a beer. And one night I thought I saw something fly by my head, and I looked up and the sky was just filled with bats. And being from the Bay Area, you know, our summers are always foggy and we just don't really think about bats here, but they are here, but we just don't see them. And so I was in my late 20s, and that was like the first time in my whole life that I had ever seen a bat or encountered one. And so I was just amazed, and I thought it was just so cool that we could sit outside in the summer and watch bats, you know, this incredible wildlife phenomenon. And so flash forward 10 years later, I was back here in San Francisco, and I was reading an article in the New Yorker by environmental journalist Elizabeth Colbert. And it was about how bats in North America were in trouble, and they were dying by the millions from this disease called white nose syndrome. And it was wiping out hibernating bats, you know, across the Northeast, and this disease was spreading. The epicenter of the disease was in Albany, New York, a cave right outside of Albany. So when I read that, I immediately thought about these bats that I had seen when I was at Syracuse, and wondering, you know, if these bats were still alive, and if students, you know, just like me, could still go out to that pub and sit out at night in the summer and witness this incredible natural phenomenon. So, I mean, when we're talking about white nose syndrome, we're talking about a disease that is wiping out entire colonies. So it's very possible, and there are accounts of bats being there one year, and the next year they're no longer there. There aren't any at all. So when I read that article, I instantly, my heart just broke. But then I also thought, you know, this is a really interesting story, and I'm going to follow it. And so that was back in 2009. And so I started following the story of white nose syndrome and its creep across the country, north to south, east to west. And I was thinking that I should make a documentary about this. So yes, there are other bat films that I made. I started filming locally because making a feature documentary is just a huge challenge. It's very expensive and very taxing, and especially if it requires travel. And being from the Bay Area, you know, the bats here are not hibernating bats, and white nose syndrome is a disease that kills hibernating bats. So I had to find a local story about bats, you know, that was interesting. And lo and behold, there's a colony of 250,000 Mexican free-tail bats who are non-hibernating bats, migrating bats, that live under the I-80 right outside of Sacramento, California.
I've seen those bats.
Yeah, it's a beautiful sight to be seen. And a lot of people grow up in Sacramento and they don't even know that they're there, you know? And so it just takes this awareness. And then once you're aware that they're there, you want to go out and see them. So I made a short film about those bats, and that short film toured around festivals and did pretty well at festivals. And when I attended in person the screenings, people would come up to me after the film screen and say, you know, when I first sat down to see your film, I was really afraid of bats, or I hated bats. But now that I've seen your film, I want to go see a bat flight, or I want to volunteer, or I want to become a bat advocate. And I was like, well, that's exactly what I'm trying to do with this film and this type of storytelling. So it was through the process of showing that short that I embarked on the journey to create the feature-length documentary.
I want to go back and have you explain white nose syndrome a little bit more. What is it? What causes it? And what is that?
White nose is caused by a fungus, and the Latin term is Pseudogymnoascus destructans. And your listeners are like, what? So they also call it PD for short. And it took me about 5 years to learn how to pronounce that. So anyway, so it's a fungus, and the fungus was tracked in to that first cave in upstate New York, most likely on like the shoes or clothing of somebody who, and so the cave in upstate New York is, it was a popular like tourist cave. And so it could have been tracked in by any tourist that had maybe visited a cave in Europe or Asia where the fungus was present, because the bats in Europe and Asia have evolved over centuries to be able to withstand the effects of this fungus and not succumb. But the bats here in North America, since it's a new fungus, it was a new disease, they're not ready. They have not evolved, and it's going to take a while for that to happen. So when the fungus was introduced to this cave, it immediately wiped out the bats. And the way that that happens is that the fungus is like irritating, just like any fungus. Like we get athlete's foot and it itches, and any kind of fungus like that wakes us up in the middle of the night and we can't sleep. So the same thing is happening to the bats because they're mammals just like us. And they wake up in the middle of their hibernation. And every time they wake up from hibernation, that is a huge energy toll. And they burn off a lot of their fat reserves. So each time they burn off their fat reserves, they have less fat, and they have less to last through the end of hibernation. So they wake up and then they're like, well, I'm awake and I'm hungry because I've just burnt off all my fat. And they look outside and there's no bugs to eat, right? And so they end up starving to death because there's no food. So the white nose syndrome is the disease caused by the fungus. And the fungus is the PD, and sometimes PD can be present, but the bats have not started dying from white nose syndrome, which is the case here in California. I think that now white nose syndrome, or the fungus that causes white nose syndrome, is present in 40 states and 8 provinces. And so it's north to south, east to west.
Wow, that makes me super sad. I'm sure someone who tracked that fungus into that cave was someone who really loved bats.
Probably, yeah. So here's what people can do. One, if you're somebody who loves bats and you're somebody who loves caves, make sure that you disinfect your shoes and clothing before you visit another cave that has bats. So for example, I think there was a jump from Minnesota to Washington State, and the scientists looked at that and they said, well, bats don't migrate that far. So it's probably a human that was in a cave that had PD, at least PD present. And then they went into a cave in Washington State. And then all of a sudden the bats start dying in Washington State. So Washington is a state where white nose is present, as opposed to just the fungus. Wash your clothes, change your clothes, and disinfect your boots with like alcohol. So every time we went into a bat habitat after filming, we would rub our shoes down with alcohol and change our clothes and wash them. I would rub the cameras down and the tripods off, just so that way we wouldn't be tracking the fungus into any other environment.
But I did see on your website that there are certain bats who are surviving this winter with white nose.
Yes.
Can you talk about that?
Yeah, so in a lot of these places where white nose has taken a heavy toll on the bat populations, sometimes there are these remnant populations. So for example, where we filmed, mostly in the Michigan Upper Peninsula, there are populations of the little brown bat that have survived the effects of white nose syndrome. So this is where Dr. Winifred Frick and her team from Bat Conservation International decided to launch a pilot program to help the remnant populations of these little brown bats survive the effects of white nose syndrome. So what they discovered is that if bats are fat enough, if they have enough fat reserves to wake up during the middle of hibernation several times because they're irritated by this fungus. Then they'll make it to spring when they can naturally go out and start feeding again on moths and all of the insects that they love to eat. So what they found was that if a bat is fat enough, then they'll survive. And so these remnant populations is what Dr. Winifred Frick and her team of bat biologists, they're trying to help them by creating a bug buffet. And the way they do that is they hang these UV lights up in the trees or, on a post outside the entrance to the hibernacula, the caves and the mines where the bats, spend the winter. And then before they go into hibernation, they don't have to fly so far to find their food. The moths and the insects that they love to eat are all just swarming around this light. And so they can just keep going back to the bug buffet and have another slice of pizza, have another like chicken wing or whatever, and then they end up getting fat, and they then go into hibernation. And then in the spring, the lights are right there as well. And if they wake up, maybe a little early, there's a light out there that will attract, the few bugs. And so then they can have a snack and they can kind of replenish their fat reserves upon leaving hibernation.
Yeah, you have some images of those lights being put up and then the bugs swarming around them. And it's such a kind of brilliant, simple idea.
Yeah.
This must be a ridiculous question, but I'll ask it anyway. Is there no way to somehow eradicate the fungus from the caves?
Well, it's not a ridiculous question because the scientists have asked that question as well. So when you think about these cave environments, there's bacteria. I mean, it's just like our stomachs, like there's good bacteria and bad bacteria. And so we want the good bacteria, because that helps us. And if they try to go in and clean the caves and the hibernacula from PD, they may also be wiping out the good bacteria. Mm-hmm. So that's not really an approach that they want to take, because right. It's a whole habitat, and it helps many species grow and survive in these conditions. So the other thing that is not possible is a vaccine. I mean, at least at this point, I know that there are people working on a vaccine for white nose syndrome. However, at this point, when there's so much that's unknown about bats and where they are and where they're hibernating and how deep the cave or the hibernacula are, and sometimes we're talking about caves that have like tens of thousands or 100,000 bats or something in there, the scientists may not be able to reach all of those places, and they may not know. And then it's spreading so fast because, the bats share the caves with other species, and then other species that don't hibernate will go to, migrate to another cave and they'll carry the fungus, but then they don't succumb because they don't hibernate. So it's kind of like a little preschool, with millions of children running around.
Right.
It's really difficult to track where the bats go that have the fungus and then where they are in the hibernacula.
Well, you said one word that I think it was Dr. Frick talking about the threat to bats. I mean, you've already mentioned that in all likelihood, the fungus was introduced by a human entering a cave where bats were. But the biggest threat is habitat loss. And I find it interesting. There's another person in one of your little clips that says it's natural that we would want to help other species. But, I'm curious to hear from you. And in fact, bats actually help us. So without bats, it would be a very, very different ecosystem and probably not one that's very livable for humans. And I would love to hear, and you may not know, but what are bats out there doing in terms of eating insects, pollinating? Like what are bats doing for us?
Yeah, they do so many things for us. And it's true. Without bats, we'd be living in a very different world. I want to frame this question inside a story about habitat loss, about potential habitat loss, and also the Yolo Causeway, which is featured in both my short film and also the feature film. So the Yolo Causeway is the bat habitat that is right outside of Sacramento and home to 250,000 Mexican free-tailed bats, approximately. These bats have decided to live under freeway. I mean, these are very versatile bats. There's plenty of bats. It's the same species of bat that lives under Congress Avenue Bridge, the Mexican free-tailed bat. So there's 2 million of them there. I think that there are freeways in Arizona and all over Texas, that have bats living under them. They kind of cluster up into these crevices in the freeway and in the overpass, or the underpass. And it just turns out that it's a great place for them to live. It's warm, they can get cozy in there. They're protected from predators. And in the case of the Yolo Causeway, it's right next to a wetland. And so there's water there and there's insects there. And it's also right next to agricultural fields. So we interviewed the rice farmer, Mike DeWitt, whose rice fields are right next to the Yolo Causeway. And he says that he doesn't really have to use pesticides because he's got this free pesticide that comes out every single night at sunset. And they go to town and they eat all of the moths that would then eat his crops. So he knows farmers that have to spend tens of thousands of dollars on pesticides every year. But that's not Mike DeWitt. He gets to benefit both financially and just from a sense of doing good for the world from this colony of bats that come in and help him out every single night. So bats provide ecosystem services, and ecosystem services are things that nature gives to us for free. So you mentioned pollination. So bats are bug eaters, pollinators, and seed dispersers. And their guano is also a great fertilizer. So some people like to use their guano for fertilizer for their garden. So let's talk about the pest control part of this. So we're talking about tens of billions of dollars a year in pest control costs. That's what bats provide farmers, I think, just in North America alone. And if we lose the bats, right, then the farming industry, the agriculture industry suffers. They're going to have to start using more pesticides in order to grow their crops. And pesticides are not good for us either. They cause cancer, they cause other kinds of respiratory and hormonal imbalances. And there's also a link to infant mortality as well in the increase of pesticide use. So there's that. And then there's pollination. So if you like chocolate, mangoes, tequila, you can say, thank you, bat, because they're the ones that pollinate those plants. And then when we talk about seed dispersal, so the fruit-eating bats that live in the tropics will eat the fruit, and then when they fly over deforested areas, then they poop out the seeds and they help to reforest deforested areas. So those are some of the ecosystem services that bats provide for us for free. And yeah, if we lose the bats, then we're losing out on the natural ecosystem. So back to the Yolo Causeway. Right now, Caltrans wants to expand the freeway. And we all know that expanding a freeway only adds to more traffic and is not a solution to traffic jams and clogged roadways. And expanding the freeway would basically disrupt the bat population that lives under the Yolo Causeway. So Corky Quirk and the Yolo Basin Foundation up there, they're definitely trying to raise awareness right now. And hopefully the film will also raise awareness about why we need to protect this bat habitat.
Wow, that's interesting. I did not know that that was a part of Caltrans, even on their radar.
I think there's been a few, people listening to this podcast can probably Google it, and there's plenty of, local news reports that have been done about this project. If we speak up and we tell people that we want to make sure that the bats underneath the causeway, I mean, not only are they helping the farmers, but the bats are losing their habitat, right? Every time that we expand and we create a new development, the bats are losing their habitat. So somehow they found out, like, hey, this highway, Interstate 80 is a great place to live. There's water here, there's bugs here. We can have our babies here. I think right now, like the babies that were born in July are now like teenagers and stuff, and they're learning to be adults themselves. But it's a maternal colony, and so it's a very protected place for these bats that are very versatile to live. And people go out. That was the other point that I was going to make, is that people go out every night to watch the bats. And it's this beautiful natural phenomenon that happens every night. They emerge from the Yolo Causeway at sunset in a ribbon across the agricultural fields, and it's just a beautiful sight to see. And once you see it the first time, you're just going to be like, wow, I never knew that it was so cool to go out and see a bat flight.
Right, right. That's how I saw it, is that one of my daughter's elementary school teacher took the class and invited all the families, obviously, because it was after school hours, there to watch the bats fly out. And it's amazing just to think that they're there, And my parents bought a house once, and for many years, they could not open the umbrellas on their patio furniture because bats were there roosting. And they didn't want to create this scenario where the bats would leave. And, I've been to barns in Oakland where you look up at the ceiling and bats are there. It's really incredible how closely we live with them without even realizing it so many times.
Yeah. And I mean, a lot of people, I mean, this whole like bats and, patio umbrellas and in the barn or other places in your house is pretty common. And because of the fear that people have about bats in general, like when people encounter a bat on their patio or in their house, sometimes they're afraid, right? And then they want to get the bat out, and they try to do that themselves or something. And you should not do that. If you have a bat on your property and you're scared, then call your local wildlife rescue and tell them what's happening, and they will talk you through it. So if you also have bats on your property and you're not afraid of them and you want to give them a safe place to live, you can get a bat house. I have a friend who did that, had the exact same thing happen in San Rafael. And she opened her umbrella one morning, and there was a little bat that was in there. And she's like, oh, I'm going to close it. And so, she's like, I don't want to disturb the bat. But they're just looking for like a safe place to sleep during the day. And so what she ended up doing was getting a bat house through us. You can find that on theinvisiblemammal.com, and you can support our film while getting a bat house. And so she bought a bat house and she put it up on a sunny spot, and she followed the directions, and, you're supposed to put it up high and in a sunny spot where it's going to be nice and warm for the bats. And now she's got like bats living in the bat house, and she said they come out every night, and and she looks down on the ground beneath the bat house, and there's like all this bat guano, and so she knows they're living in there, and so she's giving them a safe place to live now. Now they don't have to go into the patio furniture.
Right, right, right. So really quickly, there is more information on your website about bats and the coronavirus, COVID-19, which I thought was very fascinating. It was just a great visual to see people who work with bats who were masked up because the bats were much more at risk of us giving them COVID-19 than anyone getting COVID-19 from then. And that ties into all kinds of issues around habitat loss, like why, viruses do jump from species to species. It happens all the time. But if we're talking about wild animals, and also COVID-19 did not jump directly from a bat. There was an intermediary animal in between. So just briefly talking about how habitat loss and certain types of pandemics like this are related, or new viruses or things like that. If if that's something you feel like you could talk about.
Yeah, I can talk enough about it. I'm definitely not a scientist, but I have hung out with some bat scientists, and so I do know what they say. So first of all, we need to just clarify that the bats in North America do not have COVID-19, or they do not carry SARS-CoV-2, right? And so the bat scientists in North America want to keep it that way. And so they are currently going out and swabbing bats all across, the continent, and then testing those swabs to see if SARS-CoV-2 is present. And currently there is no SARS-CoV-2 in any bat in North America from what they've found, from the data that they've collected. So you cannot get COVID from a bat in North America, okay? And yes, you're right. So let's go back to, I think it's the rhinolophus bat in China that scientists have detected as like the origin of COVID, of SARS-CoV-2. But yes, what they think happened was that bat was in an illegal wildlife market, and it was being kept very near another species. And I think that they think that it was a pangolin. It could be, I think with MERS, it was a civet cat. So it's a spillover event. And that's when a coronavirus will, or a virus will jump from one species to another and then to the human. And so that's still, from what I know, is still the opinion of, or the position of most scientists. And they think that is how the COVID pandemic started. So it's important to say that, up front, is that the scientific opinion is that it was a spillover event. And so then when we're talking about preventing future pandemics, we need to really think about this concept of One Health. And this is a concept that's brought up in my feature film, The Invisible Mammal. So One Health is the concept that human health, wildlife health, and the environmental health are all connected. And so if we preserve and protect wild spaces for wildlife, they'll have a safe and healthy place to live, and we can coexist with them, because if they're healthy, then we're healthy. But if we keep invading and encroaching upon wildlife habitat by making their habitat smaller and smaller, or taking wildlife out of their natural habitat, then we increase the interactions that humans will have with species that carry coronaviruses and other kinds of viruses. And so this is one of the reasons why it's so important to protect wild places for wildlife.
And the other thing that maybe this was also Dr. Frick, was saying that there are actually protocols in place for what should happen if there is some sort of mutated virus from another mammal that gets introduced to humans, and none of them were followed. So
yeah,
it's also, I don't know, I just thought it was really good to kind of reiterate that the fact of a pandemic of COVID, that is human. The responsibility of that lies on humans and the human behavior, and not on any sort of wildlife, or particularly bats, which we're talking about now.
It's just like climate change. We can continue to put our head in the sand,
right,
and we can continue to burn fossil fuels, because that's kind of what we're doing. And climate change is still going to happen, because we did not follow the instructions, that were given by scientists, by the people who know how to predict what's going to happen. And so the same thing goes for the pandemics. I mean, there have been a lot of studies, about there's going to be another pandemic, that's going to happen, and here's how to prevent it. Mm-hmm. And those protocols were not followed, like you mentioned. So that's how we ended up, in the situation that we were in. And luckily now, we have more awareness, obviously, because now we've been through it and there's more awareness. So maybe, I'm a filmmaker, I can't make those kind of predictions. But, my hope is that maybe, I can say that. My hope is that maybe now that we've had this experience and we know what it's like to live through a pandemic, we have more awareness and more of an understanding of what needs to be done. And it's not like something that will happen in the future. It's something that could very well happen to us again, because what is predicted is that with climate change, more viruses are going to be released, whether it's through permafrost melt or, this encroachment upon wildlife habitat, more viruses will be released, and there is more potential for global pandemics to happen.
Well, I love the film you're making. I'm really excited for it to be finished. Where can people find out more about you and about this film?
So the first thing that they can do is they can follow @The Invisible Mammal on Instagram and Facebook. We post very regularly on both platforms, about progress on the film and events that people can attend. And all of our events that we're doing online or in person are on our website, theinvisiblemammal.com/events. And one more thing, if people want to help us finish the film, because our film is currently it's nearing the final stages of post-production, and we are still fundraising. So if people are interested in helping us out, and they love bats, and they want to see a film about bats and women in science finished and in festivals and in theaters and streaming, then they can go to theinvisiblemammal.com/donate, and they can make a donation, a tax-deductible donation, because we are fiscally sponsored by the Wildlands Collective, which is a 501c3.
That is wonderful. Well, thank you so much, Kristin. I'm looking forward to seeing this film. I'm excited about it, and I just appreciate it is really hard to make a feature doc. So thank you. Thank you for all of that work.
Yes, like I said, it's been many, many years in the making. And so to get to this point, it just feels really good.
Good. Well, congratulations to being this close.
Thank you. Thanks for having me on the show.
You're listening to Art Heals All Wounds. Thank you to Kristin Tièche for talking about her upcoming documentary, The Invisible Mammal. I'm going to put the info for this film in the show notes so that you can keep track of events around it, and if you want to, donate to help Kristin make it these last few steps over the finish line. I hope that, like Kristin, you love bats, or at the very least value all they contribute to maintaining a habitable ecosystem for the rest of us. And maybe you hate bats, but you love spiders. Or you hate spiders, but love snakes. Or you hate snakes, but love humans. It doesn't really matter. As Kristin explains, the idea of One Health is that in order for any of us to be healthy, we all have to be healthy. So whichever animal is your familiar, know that in wishing it the best possible outcome, you're wishing for the best possible outcome for the entire planet. Do you have a story to share about the role that art and creativity play in your life? I'd love to share it on the show. Just go to my website, arthealsallwoundspodcast.com, and leave me a voicemail. When you share your story, you help someone else. And if you want to help me keep this show going and feel like you're able, leaving a small donation for the show is really helpful. You can do that on my website by clicking on the link that says, Buy Me a Coffee. Thanks for listening. The music you've heard in this podcast is by Ketsa and Lobo Loco. This podcast was edited by Eva Hristova.